This story took place in the early 2000s, and it's true. I was hired at an assisted living facility as an activities director. The way this particular facility was set up, there were 3 different houses referred to as cottages. There was the green cottage, the red cottage, and the purple cottage. The purple cottage would have been total assist and bedbound residents. The green cottage residents needed assistance in simple day-to-day tasks, while the red cottage was more or less just physical therapy and short-term residents, all being entirely cognitive. On this particular day, I was sent to the red cottage to assist with intake. We were getting a new resident who was there for physical therapy after having had hip replacement. I was assigned alongside aides on duty to help clear and prepare this new resident's room. When I arrived in the red cottage, I learned the room we were clearing had been closed off for some time and had been being used for storage, and at first, I didn't think anything strange about that. We cleared away bits of furniture, mattresses and such, and got it prepared for our newest resident, a 100% cognitive woman named Lorna. She was excited to start her physical therapy as she was eager to get back home to her family. Her stay at the facility started without incident and as expected, with an exercise regime and healthy diet. However, that would quickly change. Within a week of being with us, Lorna developed a fever and started feeling quite unwell. All normal symptoms for a summer cold, however. Her family doctor was called in to perform a routine checkup as there was no immediate concern. Now, I don't know the results of that visit, as in if she received medication or any such thing. All I do know is that he assured us that she would be just fine in a day or 2, and she was. A couple of weeks passed uneventfully when Lorna was delivered another setback, this one sending her to the hospital. All I was told at the time was while she was with us at our facility, she had become lethargic and barely responsive. But in a lot of cases, with the elderly and infirm, dehydration is the culprit, so no one seemed too concerned. And sure enough, once at the hospital, Lorna began to perk right up. It was just a matter of days, and she was back with us, more determined than ever to get better and to go home to her family. She followed all the rules and all the instructions given to her and gave her therapy 100%. Lorna had at last reached the point where she was walking short distances unaided and doing very well. But unfortunately, an incident took place in her room while she was alone, causing her to fall and injure herself. The morning aide walked in and found her on the floor. Now, Lorna couldn't really tell us what had happened, so no one knew exactly what transpired, but it for sure was a devastating setback. However, Lorna, with her true fighting spirit, kept going. That is, until she fell ill again. Floating between all 3 cottages, I wasn't always up to date on all the day-to-day happenings with every single resident, but I was really starting to feel that something just wasn't right with Lorna. Why did issues seem to surround her? Maybe a simple string of bad luck, or could it have been something more? One afternoon, I was at the beverage counter preparing tea for the ladies at the crochet circle. This counter happened to be directly across the hallway from Lorna's room. Spotting me, she called me in. She explained that she needed to report a rodent in her room. I asked what it was that she had seen, if it were a mouse or otherwise. She then admitted she had not actually seen anything, but rather only heard it. When I prompted her to elaborate, she began to describe scuttling and scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. She told me how, late at night, when the building was quiet, she could hear it so loud that it would keep her awake. I have the tendency to be spiritually sensitive, so when she said that, I was immediately filled with dread. I was instantly hypersensitive to my surroundings and felt extremely uncomfortable in her room. I then started to put a few puzzle pieces together in my mind and wondered if Lorna's run of bad luck had something to do with the room that she was in. Was there something more going on here? Later that day, I found myself working alongside the head nurse, a beautiful and wise Hispanic woman whose name was Sophia. Sophia was of Catholic faith and seemed quite strong in her beliefs. I felt comfortable enough speaking with her, sort of off the record, if you will, so brought up the subject of Lorna's rodent problem. I told her that I didn't want her to think I was crazy, but I couldn't help but feel there was something in Lorna's room that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Not only did she not find me crazy, but she then went on to tell me that Lorna's room had a bit of a reputation. I asked her to explain what she meant. However, all she would say at that time was, the room had been locked up for a reason, and it should have stayed that way. She ended by telling me that the best thing for us would be to get Lorna well, on her feet, and out of the facility as soon as possible. What happened next happened so quickly. I had 2 days off that week, Tuesday and Wednesday. When I returned on the Thursday, I had been informed that Lorna had taken yet another spell for the worst and had been taken from the facility by ambulance. Ambulance? I thought to myself, well, that must be fairly serious. There was no real information except to say that she was lethargic and had a high fever, and the hospital was to send her back to us once she was stronger. As it turns out, that didn't take long at all. Just a mere 2 days, and she was well enough to come back. Once she had arrived at the hospital, she began to perk up immediately. So now this pattern was forming that while she was in the room at our facility, she would have these bad spells where she would become sick or injure herself. But as soon as she was out of her room with us, she would be okay. Lorna came back to us Friday that same week. Her color was good. She was bright and quite chatty when she came in that afternoon and asked for tea once she was settled. However, by the next morning when I arrived at work, she seemed down and sad, not at all like she was the day before. The dark cloud that hung over her just didn't shift, and by Sunday evening she was refusing to eat. She was much the same Monday. After my 2 days off and returning to work the following Thursday, I found Lorna in a terrible state. I was told that Wednesday she had become entirely disconnected, no interest in eating, drinking, or even speaking to anyone. She looked nothing like the woman I had left just 2 days earlier. She was very gaunt, and her color being a terrible chalky gray. I didn't have much, if anything, to do with her. She was clearly not participating in any of the activities that I was hosting. However, I would pass by her room frequently, every time peeking in on her. It's difficult to describe the feeling in her room. It was as if the oxygen was pulled from your lungs. I struggled to breathe and was immediately chilled to the bone as soon as I crossed the threshold. One afternoon, a couple of days later, I was called into the Red Cottage to assist with getting Lorna cleaned up for a doctor visit. Her family doctor was scheduled to come see her in hopes of finding answers as to why she didn't want to eat. When I joined the aide in Lorna's room, I was shocked at her condition. She was a shadow of her former self. Lorna's son had come to visit that day in order to speak with his mother's doctor, so when the aide and I entered to begin to bathe her, he excused himself to the dining room. Now, I need to stress, at this point, Lorna had not eaten for days and had lost considerable weight she certainly hadn't needed to. She hadn't spoke or moved on her own for close to a week and was effectively catatonic. I was given the task of rolling Lorna from side to side so the aide could wipe her down. With one side complete, I was about to roll her the opposite way when Lorna snapped out of her seemingly catatonic state and began screaming up the top of her lungs. She wasn't screaming words, but rather a banshee-style howl. I nearly had a heart attack as I jumped back from the bed. About that time, Lorna's son and the facility's director, a man named Robert, rushed in to see what the commotion was all about. We were all entirely stunned when Lorna rose to her knees and lunged at the aide. Now, this poor woman had come to us for standard rehabilitation, but instead had within a few months withered away to a mere skeleton. She couldn't have weighed any more than 85 pounds. Yet here she was, launching an attack on this horrified aide. Lorna's son wrapped his arms around his mother to stop her from falling from the bed, but she managed to break his hold and lunge a second time. When she did, the hospital gown that was loosely draped over her fell away, exposing her incredibly fragile body. Thin tissue-like skin barely hung to her protruding bones. Her son threw his hand to his mouth as he gasped. The look of shock and horror on his face is one that I'll never forget. He swiftly tried to conceal his mother's brittle body while again attempting to restrain her. Robert stepped in to help try and assist her son when the room suddenly became even more chaotic. The aide, who was the target of Lorna's inexplicable rage, began to yell and flail about. She was slapping at her body and began to exclaim that she was being bit. The scene was just madness, and it was so hard to process it all. This sickly, frail woman being restrained by two grown men who, if I'm being honest, seemed to be struggling with that task, All the while, the attending aide was jumping around and shouting that something was biting her, remarking that it felt like ants. Robert shouted for me to take the aide to the bathroom and to check her out. Once in there, this poor girl continued panicking, shouting that she was being bit. We quickly took her clothes off, only to find nothing. Not an ant, not a mosquito, not a scratch, not a mark of any kind. The girl was so terrified, she quit her job on the spot and left the building immediately. Now, taking a second to collect myself, upon exiting the bathroom, I ran into Robert. I asked him what in the heck was happening in Lorna's room, but he had no explanation. I had a hunch, but dare not say it. Still very shook, I too left work and went home early. Overnight, Lorna made another drastic turn for the worst, so by the time my shift the next day, the facility called the rest of her family to let them know that it was only a matter of days. A deep sadness hung over the dimly lit dining room where Lorna's family sat talking quietly amongst themselves. The mood was sad and heavy. Times like these, when families had to let their loved ones go, were never easy, but this was different. The family were waiting the arrival of the priest who was coming to pray with Lorna and them. Now, once Padre arrived, I made myself scarce. After a few moments of hiding out in the laundry room, Robert discovered me, so I was then instructed to go and offer the family some tea or coffee. Now, I would have much rather avoided the entire situation, as it didn't feel right. I didn't feel right. None of it felt right. Upon making my way back to the family, the priest had just exited Lorna's room to join them. I overheard him as he reassured the family that their mother would be fine and feel better soon. Now, feel better soon? I questioned myself. Now, I know those words are meant to be comforting, but they certainly didn't feel that way. Something was very wrong. He then mentioned the wonderful conversation he had shared with Lorna. Wait, what? Lorna hadn't spoken for days. My stomach dropped as my mind raced. I could see by the expression on the family's face that they too were shocked and confused. Lorna's son questioned the priest. He quizzically asked if Padre had been sure he had spoke with his mother. Perplexed by the question, the priest told the family how he and Lorna had spoke about her childhood home in Italy and how he was taken by her fluent Latin. It was at that moment her other son spoke up, exclaiming their mother was not born in Italy and that she hadn't even ever visited, and she most certainly did not speak Latin. Just as the realization washed over the priest's face, the most haunting and howling scream emanated from Lorna's room. A chill unlike anything I had ever experienced cut through me like a knife. Everyone present, apart from myself, rushed in to check on Lorna. I had decided at this point that I had seen enough, so I laid back in the dining room. After a few moments, her family, along with Robert and the priest, solemnly filed out, one by one. 2 of her children in tears, and one looking entirely shell-shocked. Robert came over and informed me that Lorna had passed. So I was then tasked with assisting in getting her prepared to be collected by the coroner. Myself, Sophia, the head nurse, and another aide entered Lorna's room. Lorna's soiled hospital gown was removed. I had never seen anything more despairing in my life than poor Lorna's body. There was so little left of her. Just the broken shell of a once vibrant woman lay before us. Sophia took on the task of rolling Lorna from side to side as the attending aide began to wash her down. As Sophia pulled Lorna's frail body towards her, the aide let out a shocked gasp, drawing the attention of Sophia and myself to the backside of Lorna. The horror that shot through me is inexplicable. There, hand to God, was a crucifix protruding from Lorna's rectum. I had never been more frightened or disgusted in my life, nor have I been in the last 2 decades since this happened. It was then I decided it was time for a career change. I found out later that the facility boarded up that room, never to be used again, no matter what.